Welcome to The Deep Dive, the place where we take history's most sweeping, complex global conflicts and really pull out the essential insights you need to understand how our world was actually built.
And today we're tackling something a bit different. Not a war over kings or religion, primarily, but a brutal six-decade corporate slugfest. Fought over stuff, commodities, spice, sugar, slaves.
We're diving deep into the Dutch-Portuguese War, a conflict stretching from 1598 all the way to 1663.
Yeah, 65 years.
65 years. That time frame alone tells you this wasn't just some border dispute. It was a fundamental global shift in power. And yes, they called it the Spice War for a reason. That trade, the desire to control it, that was the engine.
Absolutely. And the players involved, they really define how unique this was. On the Dutch side, you didn't have the state, funding it directly from the treasury in the usual way. You had these two enormous chartered companies, semi-sovereign entities, really.
Read the VOC.
The Verenigde Oostindische Company, yes, the Dutch East India Company. And the GWC, the Geoctroyed West-Indisch Company, the Dutch West India Company. These were basically state-sanctioned war machines built on share.
And their opponents, the Portuguese.
Yeah.
But initially they were fighting under, well, let's say difficult circumstances.
That's putting it mildly. From 1580, Portugal was tied up in the Iberian Union, dynastically joined with Spain under Philip II, the Habsburg king.
So defending Portuguese colonies wasn't necessarily Lisbon's top priority, or even Spain's.
Exactly. It depended entirely on Spanish strategic interests and, crucially, Spanish funding, which wasn't always forthcoming, especially for distant Portuguese outposts.
That's a really key point, because when Portugal finally did break free from Spain in their Restoration War starting in 1640.
Right. They got their political independence back. But by then, the damage was done. The global trading system they'd built over a century, it was already being systematically dismantled by these Dutch corporations. The most valuable parts were gone, or, under relentless attack.
And the scale of this thing, it's just staggering. Truly global. You've got invasions, long drawn-out fights in Brazil, across the Atlantic and West Africa, and then this incredibly decisive struggle for the East Indies, for the Indian Ocean.
Yeah, it wasn't really about massive land grabs like the Spanish in the Americas. It was much more about controlling the sea lanes, the choke points, achieving total commercial dominance.
And technically, it started as an extension of a European war, didn't it? The 80 Years' War.
It did. The Dutch War for Independence against the Spanish Habsburgs. But look, the overseas part, this Dutch-Portuguese conflict, its objectives were almost purely commercial. For the Dutch, this was a golden opportunity: seize a ready-made global empire, restructure those incredibly lucrative trade networks Portugal had monopolized.
Okay, so let's talk about the spark. The casus belli. You said it was economic?
Really economic and deeply retaliatory. As soon as the Habsburgs controlled Portugal, Philip II slapped a total embargo on Dutch trade with Lisbon.
Which was the main European hub for Asian spices at the time.
Exactly. He cut the Dutch rebels off from their source of high-profit goods. The idea was to cripple them financially.
But it backfired massively.
Spectacularly. It's probably one of the biggest strategic blunders in early modern economics. Instead of starving the Dutch, it forced them. It forced Dutch money, Dutch ships, Dutch ingenuity to go find the source of the spices themselves.
If you can't buy from the distributor.
You become the distributor. Or rather, you go straight to the producer and cut out the middleman entirely.
And wasn't there another angle? Didn't Portugal actually rely quite a bit on Dutch shipping for their own colonial logistics?
Absolutely. The Dutch had, by far, the most efficient bulk cargo fleet in Europe. They were the truckers of the sea. Cutting them off didn't just hurt Dutch merchants, it created immediate problems for supplying Portuguese colonies, especially far-flung ones in Asia. Spain might have had the warships, but the Dutch had the affordable, reliable shipping. It was really an act of economic self-sabotage by Philip.
So the Dutch are cut off. They're motivated. But they need to know what exactly they're going after. And then comes this aha moment. Almost literally stumbling upon treasure.
Right. It wasn't just theory. It was tangible proof. In 1592, English privateers, technically allies of the Dutch at this point, captured this enormous Portuguese galleon, the Madre de Deus, off the Azores.
And this wasn't just any ship.
No. This was a treasure chest floating on the Atlantic. It had 900 tons of goods from India and China: silks, porcelain, jewels, ivory, and of course spices: pepper, cloves, nutmeg. The estimated value, around £500,000 sterling.
£500,000 in 1592. That's Astronomical.
It was almost half the entire annual revenue of the English crown at the time, half the treasury. Imagine the impact. News spread like wildfire across Northern Europe, especially in Amsterdam.
So this gave everyone a very clear picture.
A foretaste, as one contemporary writer put it, irrefutable proof of the staggering wealth available if you could just reach the East Indies directly. It absolutely galvanized Dutch investors and merchants. The potential payoff was suddenly crystal clear.
Okay, so they have the motivation, they know the prize, but how do you get there? The Portuguese guarded those routes fiercely for a century. Secrecy was paramount.
It was. Their whole Mar Clausum policy, the closed sea, depended on keeping navigational knowledge secret. But then came the leak, a huge one.
Jan Huygens van Linschoten.
Exactly. A Dutchman who had actually worked for the Portuguese in Goa in the Indian Ocean. He comes back, and in 1595, he publishes this incredibly detailed travel report, his Itinerario.
And this wasn't just stories. It had maps, details. It had everything. Specific sailing directions, depths, currents, landmarks, safe anchorages, even advice on local customs and politics. Critically, it included the routes not just to India, but all the way to the Spice Islands, the Moluccas, and even Japan.
So, a century of Portuguese secrecy, blown wide open by one book. Pretty much. Linschoten turned the East Indies from this sort of mythical, dangerous place into a concrete, navigable destination. A business plan, almost.
So you've got the proof of wealth from the Madre de Deus, and now the roadmap from Linschoten. What happens next?
Organization. Capital mobilization. The Dutch realized individual voyages were too risky, too expensive. You needed scale, you needed structure. This leads directly to the creation of the great chartered companies.
The English East India Company comes first, 1600.
Yes, but the real game changer was the Dutch Verenigde de Oost-Indische Company, the VOC, founded just 2 years later in 1602. It was different. Bigger, more powerful, more aggressive from the start.
You called it a weaponized corporation. What made the VOC so different?
Its charter, its explicit goal wasn't just trade, it was to establish a monopoly on the spice trade, violently if necessary. It pooled capital from across the Dutch Republic through shares, spreading risk and enabling massive investment.
And it had powers far beyond a normal company, right?
Unprecedented powers, granted by the Dutch government, the States General. The VOC could negotiate treaties, mint its own money, build forts, raise armies, wage war. It was essentially a state within a state, operating overseas. No corporation had ever wielded that kind of geopolitical power.
Okay, so the weapon is forged. Now it needs a justification to start firing. A legal or ideological cover.
And that comes quickly. In 1603, just a year after the VOC's founding, 3 of its ships attack and capture another hugely wealthy Portuguese galleon, the Santa Catarina, in the Strait of Singapore.
Another treasure ship.
Absolutely massive prize. Selling its cargo reportedly doubled the VOC's entire capital overnight. Huge boost. But there was a legal snag.
How so?
Well, under existing Dutch law, was it actually legal for a private company's ships to just attack and seize a ship belonging to a nation they weren't formally at war with in Asia? Portugal and the Dutch Republic weren't officially at war yet, not directly. It caused a huge scandal back in Amsterdam, especially among some shareholders who had sort of moral or legal qualms.
So the VOC needed to justify its actions.
Exactly. And this crisis, this need for justification, leads directly to one of the most influential legal ideas in history. The VOC hired a brilliant young lawyer, Hugo Grotius.
Grotius, the free sea.
Mare Liberum, published in 1609, though he wrote the core arguments earlier in response to the Santa Catarina affair. Grotius argued, quite radically, that the seas were international territory, common to all, open for navigation and trade by any nation.
Directly attacking the Portuguese idea of Mare Clausum, the closed sea.
Precisely. It was a devastatingly effective argument. It provided the perfect ideological and, crucially, legal justification for the Dutch to use their superior naval power to break Portugal's monopoly. They essentially said, we have the right to sail anywhere, trade anywhere, and if you try to stop us based on your outdated closed sea claim, we have the right to use force.
So the irony is, they used the principle of free trade and open seas to justify violently establishing their own exclusive trading empire.
That's the crux of it. Mare Liberum wasn't just philosophy. It was a tool, a weapon, to legitimize commercial aggression and colonial expansion.
Okay, so we've got the motives, the corporate structure, the legal cover. Let's turn to the main battlefield where the old Portuguese system really crumbled. Asia.
Right. The Portuguese Estado da India, their state of India, it wasn't a land empire like Spain's, it was a thalassocracy, an empire built on sea power, controlling key maritime locations.
Not trying to conquer vast interiors.
No, very different model. It all relied on controlling a network of fortified choke points,
Yeah.
and there were four absolutely critical bases that held the whole thing together. You have to understand these four to see how the Dutch dismantled it.
Let's lay them out first. Goa.
Goa, on the west coast of India, that was the capital. The viceroy's seat, the administrative heart, the main link back to Lisbon, everything flowed through Goa.
Okay, second.
Hormuz, at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. Controlling Hormuz meant controlling and taxing the immense trade flowing between Persia, Arabia, Mesopotamia, and the Indian Ocean. Hugely profitable.
Third, you mentioned Malacca.
Malacca, absolutely vital. It controlled the narrow strait between the Malay Peninsula and Sumatra, the gateway between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. Lose Malacca, and you essentially cut the empire in two. The spinal cord, as some historians call it.
Connecting India to the Far East.
Exactly. And fourth, Macau.
Macau, near Canton in China.
Yes. Macau was the specialized base for the highly lucrative trade with China, and particularly the extremely profitable exchange of Chinese silk for Japanese silver. A very specific but incredibly valuable trade route.
So Goa, Hormuz, Malacca, Macau. These four anchors held the network. And the Portuguese enforced their control how? With licenses.
Primarily through the cartaz system. Basically, any merchant ship trading in the Indian Ocean was supposed to buy a Portuguese license, a cartaz, and call at Portuguese ports to pay customs duties. If you were caught without one, well, your ship and cargo could be seized. It was maritime extortion on a grand scale, enforced by their naval patrols radiating out from these key bases.
And the whole thing was financed by this triangular trade model. Broadly, yes. Goods from Europe, copper, textiles, wine were traded in Africa for gold or slaves. Those were then used in Asia to buy spices, or sometimes to pay the garrisons. Then the high-value spices went back to Lisbon for massive profits, funding the next cycle. So the Dutch see this system. It's geographically spread out, reliant on sea control. What's their strategy?
Well, they had a key constraint. Manpower. The Netherlands was a small country compared to Spain or even Portugal. They simply didn't have the population for large-scale colonization like the Spanish model. So a direct assault on Goa, the heavily fortified center, wasn't the initial plan.
What did they do instead?
They focused on two things: achieving absolute naval supremacy and targeting the periphery. Go after the source of the spices, especially in the Indonesian archipelago, and seize the choke points one by one. Cut the arteries, strangle the network.
And this led them to set up their own headquarters far away from Goa.
Exactly. That was the genius, or perhaps the ruthlessness, of Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, a key VOC governor general. He decided they needed a central base in Southeast Asia itself. So in 1619, they conquered the Javanese port of Jayakarta and renamed it Batavia, modern-day Jakarta.
Why Batavia?
Strategic location. It was safely distant from Goa's main naval power, but crucially, it was close to the Moluccas, the Spice Islands, the source of cloves and nutmeg, and also well-positioned to control the Sunda Strait, another key passage, and eventually challenge Malacca. Cohen understood, control the production source, not just the distribution hub.
And Cohen wasn't exactly gentle about establishing control, was he? The Banda Islands.
No, Cohen was infamous for his brutality. To secure a total VOC monopoly on nutmeg and mace, he didn't just conquer the Banda Islands in 1621, he systematically massacred or deported almost the entire native population, replacing them with Dutch planters using slave labor.
Wow, that's stark.
It really shows the difference between, say, traditional royal objectives and the single-minded profit motive of a corporation like the VOC, backed by overwhelming force. The Here and the Seventh Instance, the board of directors back in Amsterdam, they supported this. It was about securing the monopoly, full stop.
So Batavia becomes the Dutch center. And for the next 4 decades, it's basically Goa versus Batavia.
A relentless naval struggle. And the key Dutch weapon throughout was the blockade.
Blockade in Goa itself.
Yes. It wasn't constant initially, started around 1603, but between 1604 and 1645, the Dutch maintained increasingly effective blockades of Goa, especially during the monsoon sailing season. This systematically choked Portuguese India. It cut off reliable communication and reinforcement from Lisbon for huge stretches of the war. The lifeline was severed.
And while Goa was being strangled, the Dutch picked off the other key points.
Sequentially, yes, it was a strategic dismantling. The first major naval blow was actually off Malacca in 1615. A Dutch fleet inflicted a heavy defeat on the Portuguese, seriously damaging their naval capacity in Southeast Asia and making that vital Goa-Macau route much more dangerous.
Then the western flank. Hormuz.
Hormuz fell in 1622. And interestingly, it wasn't just the Dutch, it was a combined operation. The Persian Safavid Empire, wanting to regain control, allied with the English East India Company. Their joint forces besieged and captured Qeshm Island and then Hormuz itself.
So Portugal loses control of the entire Persian Gulf trade.
Right.
Huge revenue loss.
Massive. And it showed that other European powers were now getting involved, chipping away at the Portuguese monopoly.
But the truly decisive blow in Asia, you said it was Malacca?
Malacca, 1641. After years of skirmishes and a final brutal 7-month siege, the Dutch captured it. This was the killer blow to the network. It physically broke that spinal cord between the Indian Ocean and the Far East. The Portuguese Asian Empire was now fragmented, bleeding out.
And what about Macau? The Dutch never took Macau itself, did they?
No, they tried 4 times, actually, and failed. The defenses were strong, and the local population fiercely resisted. But its economic reason for being was crippled anyway.
How?
In 1639, the Tokugawa shogunate in Japan, becoming increasingly isolationist, expelled all Jesuits and consequently all Portuguese traders from Nagasaki.
Cutting off the silver for silk trade.
Exactly. That Japan trade was Macau's golden goose. Without the Japanese silver, Macau survived as a Portuguese enclave, but its immense economic importance evaporated. So the Dutch achieved their goal, ending the competition without needing a direct military conquest there.
And the Dutch just kept rolling up the remaining coastal areas, even after Portugal regained independence from Spain.
Yes, the VOC's momentum seemed unstoppable in Asia. Portugal becoming independent in 1640 didn't really change the dynamic there. The Dutch took the whole of Ceylon, crucial for cinnamon, completing the conquest by 1658. And then they moved on to the Malabar coast of India, taking the last Portuguese strongholds there, including Kochi, by 1663.
That campaign on Ceylon, wasn't there a specific naval action there that really highlights the fight around 1654?
Yes, the actions near Colombo in 1654 are quite illustrative. It wasn't just about conquest, it was about the desperate Portuguese attempts to keep sea lanes open to Goa, which was still holding out but increasingly isolated.
What happened?
Well, on March 23rd, 1654, you had a small Portuguese squadron, just 5 galleons trying to escort merchant ships, attempting to break through the Dutch blockade around Ceylon. There was a fierce, confused fight. The Portuguese actually managed to board and briefly capture 2 Dutch ships, the Windham and the Rhinoceros.
So some success?
Momentary success, but costly. They lost key officers in the confusion and couldn't hold the Dutch ships. It showed their grit, but also their desperation. The really decisive engagement came shortly after, on May 2nd.
What happened then?
11 Dutch ships, under a very capable commander, Raeklof van Goens, cornered 3 of the main Portuguese galleons that had been involved in the earlier fight. The Portuguese were heavily outnumbered and outgunned. The Dutch ships were generally better built for war by this point.
So, facing defeat.
The Portuguese captains made a hard choice. Rather than surrender their ships to the Dutch, they deliberately ran them aground near Cabo de Rama and set them on fire. The Santo Antonio de Matagão, the São João Perola, major warships, gone.
Why was that so significant?
Because it removed a substantial part of the remaining Portuguese naval strength in the Indian Ocean in one go. It basically guaranteed Dutch naval supremacy for the final sieges on Ceylon and later the Malabar coast. There just wasn't much left to effectively challenge them at sea in Asia.
So the picture in Asia is clear. Portugal holds on to Goa and Macau, geographically, but the economic empire, the spice monopoly, the network, it's shattered. The VOC has won that theater.
Fundamentally, yes. The wealth shifted decisively. The Dutch controlled the sources, the sea lanes. Lisbon was no longer the center of the spice trade.
Okay, let's pivot dramatically across the globe to the Atlantic. Because there was a whole other war front there, driven by the other Dutch company, the GWC. And the prize wasn't spice, it was sugar.
Exactly. The Dutch West India Company, the GWC, founded in 1621, its mandate was specifically to operate in the Atlantic West Africa and the Americas, take on the Spanish and, crucially, the Portuguese there. They have a New Netherland project, sure, but the big prize was Brazil.
Brazil's sugar plantations, the richest in the world at the time.
By far. And the GWC aimed to replicate the VOC's success. seize the production centers.
But you mentioned earlier the GWC wasn't as successful as the VOC. Why the difference?
Several reasons. The GWC structure was maybe less ruthlessly efficient, more prone to internal politics, but fundamentally their target commodity was different. Spices were high value, relatively low volume. Sugar was lower margin, high volume.
Which requires different logistics.
Completely. Sugar requires vast amounts of land, huge amounts of labor, slave labor, and control over territory, not just coastal forts. It meant the GWC got bogged down in costly land wars and colonization efforts, which drained its resources much faster than the VOC's trade-focused model. They constantly needed subsidies from the Dutch government.
So their initial invasion of Brazil
Kicked off in 1624, they actually captured the capital, San Salvador da Bahia, a major coup.
but they didn't hold it for long.
No. This immediately showed the GWC's vulnerability. The Iberian Union, seeing a direct threat to its richest colony, reacted strongly. They assembled a massive joint Spanish-Portuguese fleet, 52 ships, 12,000 men, and retook Salvador just a year later in 1625.
A big setback for the GWC.
Huge. But they didn't give up. They learned. Their next attempt in 1630 was better planned. They targeted Pernambuco further north. They captured the key towns of Olinda and Recife,
Which they renamed Mauritsstad.
yes, after Johann Moritz, or John Maurice of Nassau, who became the governor. And this area, Pernambuco, this was the absolute heartland of sugar production. They now controlled the richest sugar region on Earth.
But control wasn't easy. The Portuguese didn't just disappear.
Not at all. The Portuguese commander, Matias de Albuquerque, was incredibly resourceful. He refused to surrender. He retreated inland, set up a fortified camp called the Arraial do Bom Jesus, and launched a brutal, highly effective guerrilla war.
So the Dutch held the cities, the ports.
But they couldn't control the countryside initially. For about 5 years, until 1635, they were basically confined to the walled towns. They couldn't safely harvest the sugarcane, couldn't make the colony pay, because Portuguese partisans were constantly raiding plantations, ambushing patrols, burning crops.
How did the Dutch break out of that?
Well, they got help, controversial help, from a local landowner named Domingos Fernandes Calabar.
A defect.
Yes. Calabar was a mulatto, of mixed Portuguese and African or indigenous heritage. He knew the terrain intimately, knew the Portuguese tactics. For reasons we can only speculate on, perhaps feeling marginalized by the Portuguese, perhaps seeing opportunity, he switched sides and guided the Dutch.
And that made a difference.
A significant difference, temporarily. His knowledge allowed the Dutch to finally push out, capture more territory, and start getting the sugar economy running. But Calabar's story ends grimly.
He was captured.
Captured by Albuquerque's forces during a retreat. He was tried and publicly hanged as a traitor in Porto Calvo. His execution became a powerful rallying symbol for the Portuguese resistance, a stark warning.
Despite the guerrilla war, the Dutch did manage to expand under John Maurice, didn't they?
They did. John Maurice was a capable administrator, interested in science and art, as well as conquest. By 1641, Dutch Brazil, or New Holland, stretched over a significant area of northeastern Brazil, from Maranhão down to the Sergipe River.
But that whole sugar economy, as you said, depended on massive amounts of labor, slave labor.
Absolutely critical. To make New Holland profitable, the GWC needed to control the source of that labor. They needed to complete the third leg of the Atlantic triangular trade. They needed to seize control of the slave trading posts in West Africa from the Portuguese.
So Africa becomes the next major target.
An immediate priority. They went after the Portuguese forts along the Gold Coast, modern Ghana, and in Angola. Elmina Castle, a major Portuguese stronghold on the Gold Coast, had resisted an earlier Dutch attack in 1625, where the Dutch were badly ambushed. But they came back and finally captured it in 1637.
And other African holdings.
São Tomé Island fell, and by 1642 the Dutch controlled most of the former Portuguese Gold Coast. But the real prize for fueling Brazil was Angola.
Luanda.
Luanda and Benguela, the main ports for the Angolan slave trade. And here the Dutch used diplomacy alongside force. In 1641, they forged a very effective three-way alliance with the powerful Kingdom of Congo, inland from Luanda, which had its own grievances with the Portuguese, and crucially, with the formidable Queen Nzinga of Ndongo and Matamba. She was a brilliant strategist and a fierce, lifelong opponent of Portuguese encroachment.
An alliance of convenience against a common enemy.
Exactly. With Congolese and Nzinga's forces supporting them, a Dutch successfully captured both Luanda and Benguela in 1641.
So at this point, 1641-42, the GWC seems to have achieved its goal. They hold the sugar plantations in Brazil, and they control the main sources of slave labor in West Africa.
On paper, yes, they controlled the key points of the triangle. Theoretically, their Atlantic empire was complete and should have been immensely profitable.
But it didn't last, and the reversal was, well, surprising.
It came from an unexpected direction. Remember, by the mid-1640s, Portugal itself is independent from Spain again, but deeply mired in its own war of independence in Europe. They couldn't spare major resources to send fleets halfway around the world to Africa or Brazil.
So the initiative came from the colonies themselves.
From Brazil specifically. The Portuguese governor of Rio de Janeiro, Salvador Correia de Sá e Benavides, a very determined figure, decided he couldn't wait for help from Lisbon. He took matters into his own hands.
What did he do?
He organized a military expedition in Brazil to sail across the South Atlantic and retake Luanda from the Dutch. Entirely a colonial initiative.
That's incredible. Funding it, organizing it, all locally.
A remarkable feat of logistics and willpower. He gathered ships, troops, supplies, mostly from Rio and other Brazilian ports. In 1648, his fleet arrived off Luanda.
And the Dutch in Luanda.
They were actually caught somewhat by surprise, and de Sá, despite potentially being outnumbered tactically, put on a very bold show of force upon landing. He demanded immediate surrender.
And it worked.
It worked spectacularly. The Dutch garrison, perhaps demoralized or poorly led, surrendered Luanda and effectively all of Angola to de Sá on August 15, 1648. A stunningly swift reversal.
Wow. Just like that, the GWC loses its main source of labor.
Exactly, and the domino effect was immediate. When the Dutch forces holding São Tomé heard that Luanda had fallen so quickly, they just abandoned the island. The African linchpin of the GWC's Atlantic system was gone.
Which must have sealed the fate of Dutch Brazil.
Pretty much. The collapse there followed swiftly, driven by internal factors as well. The key event was the insurrection of Pernambuco, which actually started a few years earlier in 1645.
What caused the revolt?
A mix of things. John Maurice, the relatively popular governor, had been recalled by the GWC in 1644 trying to cut costs. His replacements were harsher. There was deep-seated religious and cultural friction, Calvinist Dutch rulers over a population of fiercely Catholic Portuguese planters and their dependents.
And economic pressure.
Big time. The GWC was trying to recoup its massive investments. They started aggressively collecting debts from the local sugar planters, many of whom were already struggling after years of disruption from the earlier guerrilla war. It pushed them over the edge.
Who led the revolt?
Ironically, one of the main leaders was João Fernandes Vieira, a wealthy mulatto planter himself, someone who had initially perhaps benefited from the Dutch presence, but now felt squeezed and alienated. He rallied the disgruntled landowners.
And this wasn't just partisan skirmishes anymore.
No, this was a full-scale rebellion. The GWC forces suffered a major defeat early on at the Battle of Tabocas. It showed the Dutch couldn't actually hold the interior, the plantations, without significant local consent, which they had completely lost.
Was there a final decisive battle?
Yes, the Second Battle of Garapes in 1649. It was a catastrophic defeat for the Dutch forces. Well-led Portuguese-Brazilian troops fighting on familiar terrain crushed the GWC army. That battle essentially sealed the fate of New Holland.
So the Dutch were pushed back to the coast again.
Back to Recife and a few other strongholds, but it was just a matter of time. The revolt continued, the Portuguese blockaded Recife by sea, and finally, in January 1654, the last Dutch forces in Brazil surrendered. The GWC's American dream was over.
So quite a contrast. The VOC triumphs in Asia, securing its monopoly. The GWC fails spectacularly in the Atlantic. Which brings us to the endgame. How did this decades-long global conflict finally wrap up?
With a treaty, of course, the Treaty of The Hague. But the negotiations were complicated. After being kicked out of Brazil in 1654, the GWC and parts of the Dutch Republic were furious. They wanted revenge. They wanted Brazil back.
They were busy elsewhere, weren't they?
Yes. Critically, the Dutch Republic got immediately embroiled in the First Anglo-Dutch War, 1652-1654. Fighting England took priority and resources. This delay gave the Portuguese breathing room in Brazil.
So when peace talks eventually happened, who was driving the Dutch side?
The key figure was Johan de Witt, the Grand Pensionary of Holland. He was the leading politician in the Dutch Republic at the time, a pragmatist focused on commerce and state finance.
And he wasn't keen on retaking Brazil.
Not really. He saw Brazil as a money pit, a colony that required constant, expensive military protection and hadn't delivered consistent profits for the GWC. He favored cutting their losses.
What did he want instead?
Money. A massive indemnity payment from Portugal for the GWC's losses. and, crucially, formal Portuguese recognition of the VOC's gains in Asia. De Witt prioritized the profitable VOC empire over the failed GWC one. He demanded 8 million guilders.
Huge sum. How did the Portuguese react?
Initially, they refused. They'd won Brazil back fair and square, they felt. Why should they pay? But de Witt applied pressure. The Dutch Navy blockaded the Portuguese coast again, hitting their trade hard, threatening the links to what remained of their empire.
And the VOC was still active in the East.
Yes, that was key leverage. Even while negotiations were happening, the VOC was still conquering Portuguese posts in India. This relentless pressure, both naval and commercial, finally forced Portugal's hand. They needed the war to end to survive and rebuild.
So the Treaty of The Hague, when was it finally settled?
Agreed in principle in 1661, though the final ratifications and implementation dragged on until 1663. The terms were pretty much what de Witt wanted.
The Dutch give up Brazil.
Formally ceded Brazil back to Portugal, a huge win for the Portuguese crown, securing their most valuable colony.
In exchange for?
8 million guilders, an enormous sum that Portugal struggled to pay for decades, burdening their treasury. And, critically, Portugal formally ceded Ceylon, Sri Lanka, and the Spice Islands, the Moluccas, to the Dutch VOC. They recognized the reality of the VOC's dominance in Asia.
And it's amazing you mentioned the VOC finished conquering the Malabar coast after the treaty was signed.
Yeah, Kochi fell in 1663. It just shows the momentum and the sort of semi-independent drive of the VOC on the ground. The treaty was signed in Europe, but they were still finishing the job in India. Corporate objectives overriding state diplomacy almost.
Okay, let's look at the final scorecard. Who lost what? Who kept what?
Portugal's losses were primarily in Asia and Africa. Malacca, Ceylon, the Malabar coast, their posts on the Gold Coast, Arguin, Goree. These were the crown jewels of their old trading empire, the spice routes.
They kept some major territories.
Crucially, yes. They kept Brazil, which became the absolute center of their reconstituted empire. They kept Mozambique and Angola in Africa, vital for the Atlantic slave trade system. And they kept Goa and Macau in Asia, symbols of past glory but still strategically located.
So the empire survived but transformed.
Completely transformed. It shifted its economic center of gravity from the Indian Ocean spice trade to the Atlantic sugar and slave triangle based on Brazil and Angola. And as we've been saying, the real downfall for Portugal wasn't just losing forts. It was the economic restructuring. The war shattered their mare clausum doctrine forever. Lisbon was no longer the gateway to Asian riches for Europe. The Dutch now held the monopoly on the most valuable spices and, very importantly, the exclusive trade with Japan.
This didn't just benefit the Dutch, did it? It opened the floodgates.
Absolutely. By breaking the Portuguese monopoly, the Dutch inadvertently paved the way for others. The English, the French. Any European power with enough capital, ships, and ambition could now try their luck in the Indian Ocean. Portugal simply couldn't compete anymore on that scale. They lacked the population, the easy access to capital, the large domestic market that powers like England or France had.
There's one more implication we should touch on the impact back in Europe, specifically on Portuguese-Spanish relations.
Right. During those crucial 60 years when Portugal was part of the Iberian Union, 1580-1640, many Portuguese felt deeply resentful. They believed Spain prioritized defending its own silver fleets and American colonies while neglecting the defense of the arguably more vulnerable Portuguese trading posts in Asia and Africa.
So seeing their empire crumble under Dutch attack while ruled by a Spanish king
Fueled immense anger and nationalism. This sense of Spanish neglect, of being sacrificed, was a major contributing factor to the popular support for the Portuguese Restoration War in 1640. Breaking free from Spain was partly driven by the desire to save what was left of their own empire. So the Spice War weakened Portugal globally, but paradoxically helped spur its independence in Europe.
It's a conflict with so many layers: corporate power, global strategy, economic shifts, nationalism.
It really demonstrates a crucial transition in global power. This Spice War proved, maybe for the first time on such a scale, that these new corporate entities, the VOC especially, could be more effective, more adaptable, and ultimately more lethal instruments of state power and economic domination than traditional royal governments and armies. They could finance war, organize logistics, and justify aggression in ways monarchies often struggle to.
Which brings us to our final thought for you, the listener, to consider. We talked about Hugo Grotius and Mare Liberum, the Free Sea. It's stunning, really, that a legal argument, a piece of writing, became such a powerful weapon for trade expansion, for justifying corporate warfare.
It absolutely did. It provided the ideological lubricant for centuries of European maritime expansion.
So think about this. How different might the history of colonialism, the history of the Indian Ocean, and indeed global trade itself look today if Grotius had not successfully argued for the principle of mare liberum? If the Dutch hadn't had that powerful justification to break the Portuguese monopoly by force, the law didn't just follow power here. It actively shaped the battlefield for global commerce.
A fascinating question. That legal shift arguably redefined the rules of international engagement for centuries to come.
A thought to leave you with. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.